My wife straightened my tie in the parking garage of the Portland Art Museum and looked me dead in the eye. "Leland," she said, "I need you to understand something before we go in there. Tonight is important. This is not the time for your stories about fieldwork in Sudan or whatever you feel like bringing up at dinner. Just smile, hold your drink, and let me handle everything." I looked at her. Cordelia, 47 years old, dressed in a gown that cost more than my first car. Her dark hair pinned up so perfectly it looked painted on. She was so beautiful it almost hurt. And she was looking at me like I was a problem she hadn't finished solving. "Stay in the back," she added, almost as an afterthought. "Don't embarrass me." Then she smoothed her lipstick in the reflection of a parked Mercedes, clicked her heels toward the elevator, and left me standing there in a borrowed tuxedo, holding a parking ticket I didn't know what to do with. That was October 11th, 7 months ago. And what happened inside that building, what happened when the guest of honor finally arrived, didn't just change my marriage. It changed everything I thought I knew about who I was. My name is Leland Ashworth. I'm 56 years old. I spent 22 years working in international humanitarian aid, mostly East Africa and Southeast Asia, before a torn Achilles and a bad case of burnout brought me back to Portland for good. Now I consult part-time for a nonprofit in the Pearl District and spend most mornings drinking coffee on my back porch, watching the Willamette River and pretending I've made peace with stillness. Cordelia and I have been married for 14 years. We met at a fundraiser, appropriately enough. She was the events director for a mid-sized wealth management firm called Hargrove Capital, and I was the keynote speaker, half jet-lagged and wearing a shirt I'd bought in a Nairobi airport. She thought I was charming in the way people find old buildings charming, interesting to look at, not necessarily something you want to live in. We got married anyway. For a long time, it worked. She was organized, driven, connected. I was worldly, low maintenance, and willing to show up wherever she needed me. We didn't always understand each other, but we fit. Then she got promoted to senior partner relations director, and things shifted. The new job meant a different social orbit. Corporate galas, black tie fundraisers, client dinners at places where the menu has no prices. Cordelia moved through these events like she'd been born for them. I moved through them like a man walking through a fog, nodding at the right moments, forgetting names 30 seconds after hearing them. She started correcting me in public. Small things at first. Leland means the other nonprofit, not that one. Leland, let's not get into the politics of it tonight. But the corrections got more pointed over time, and then came the new habit, positioning me at the edges of conversations, steering me toward the bar or the bathroom while she worked the room, making me smaller so she could be bigger. I told myself I didn't mind. I told myself I was tired anyway. I told myself that retirement had made me irrelevant and maybe she was just protecting me from my own irrelevance. I'm not proud of that. But that's where I was on the night of October 11th, standing in a parking garage being told to stay in the back and not embarrass her. Before we go on, if this hit you, subscribe, like, and comment where you're listening from. Let me know I'm not alone. We'll get through this together. The Portland Art Museum Gala was hosted by something called the Pacific Northwest Cultural Foundation. It was held on the upper floor of the museum's main building, overlooking the North Park blocks. I'd walked past those blocks 1,000 times, scraggly elm trees, dog walkers, chess players on the benches, but from up there, at night, with string lights and a jazz quartet, even Portland looked elegant. The occasion was the foundation's annual fundraiser, but this year it had extra weight. The organization's longtime primary benefactor, a man named Douglas Crane, had recently sold his controlling interest in the foundation to a private investor. The new owner, everyone kept saying, was flying in from New York for this event. Nobody seemed to know much about her, just that she was wealthy, serious, and had very specific ideas about how the foundation should be run. Cordelia had been working on this relationship for 4 months. The new investors team had been in contact with Hargrove Capital about potential portfolio services, and tonight was the chance to make a real impression. Cordelia had rehearsed talking points. She'd bought a new gown. She'd had her assistant research the investors' known preferences and charitable history. She had not mentioned anything to me about who the investor was. I assumed this was because she didn't think I needed to know. The room was maybe 300 people. I recognized a few faces. Portland's social world isn't enormous. But mostly I was surrounded by people who moved through wealth the way I'd once moved through refugee camps, with the comfortable familiarity of someone who's been there long enough to stop noticing the extremity of it. I did what Cordelia had asked. I stayed near the edges. I got a glass of sparkling water. I watched the jazz quartet play something that sounded like Bill Evans covering a song I couldn't name. I made conversation with a retired judge named Fletcher who wanted to talk about salmon fishing on the Deschutes River, and I was genuinely enjoying that conversation. Genuinely, because Fletcher was the kind of man who talks about something because he loves it, not to impress you. When the room shifted, it wasn't a sound. It wasn't an announcement. It was just that kind of atmospheric pressure change that happens when someone arrives who the room has been waiting for. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even the jazz quartet seemed to soften. I turned with everyone else, and the breath left my body. She was 60, maybe 62. Tall, with the kind of posture that either comes from military school or a life spent refusing to fold. Her hair was silver, cut close, and she wore a deep navy suit. Not a gown, a suit, with a single strand of pearls that probably cost more than this building's insurance policy. She was flanked by two younger aides who were clearly there to manage her schedule, not her. But none of that is why my breath left my body. The reason was her face. I knew that face. Not from a photo, not from a news article. I knew it the way you know a landscape you grew up near, not from description, but from something deeper. Bone structure, the angle of the jaw, the way the eyes held a particular light that I had only ever seen once before in my life, in a mirror, every single morning. She was moving through the room with her aides, accepting greetings, shaking hands with the methodical focus of a person who does not waste motion. I watched her work the room and I could not move. Fletcher was saying something about dry flies and I could not hear a word of it. And then she stopped. She was 30 feet away, in the middle of a handshake with the foundation's executive director, and she just stopped, mid-movement, and turned, and looked directly at me. I don't know how long we stood there. It might have been 3 seconds. It felt like standing on the edge of something very high. Then she said something to her aide, and the aide nodded, and she started walking toward me. Past the executive director she'd been greeting, past a city council member who'd been waiting to introduce himself, past Cordelia, who was standing 12 feet away with her hand half extended in introduction. Past all of them. She walked straight to me, and when she was close enough that I could see her eyes clearly, I saw something I had not expected. She was crying, not breaking down, not making a scene, just her eyes had filled, the way a person's eyes fill when they are looking at something they believed they would never see. She said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I've been looking for you for 28 years. Behind her, somewhere in the room, I heard the sound of glass hitting a marble floor. I turned. Cordelia was standing very still, staring at us, her champagne glass in pieces at her feet. Her name was Nadia Whitmore. That was the name she'd taken after her second marriage, but she was born Nadia Reyes in Portland, Oregon in 1964. She'd grown up in the St. John's neighborhood, daughter of a Puerto Rican father and an Irish-American mother who'd met at a diner on North Lombard Street and spent 20 years making something out of very little. I didn't learn any of this at the gala. That night, all I knew was, that she was standing in front of me, her composure partially recovered, and she was saying, "You look exactly like him. Exactly. It's like looking at a photograph that decided to walk." "Like who?" I managed. "My brother," she said. "My half-brother. His name was Raymond." And then the aide appeared at her shoulder quietly and said, "Ms. Whitmore, the foundation director is—" "I know," she said, not looking away from me. 5 minutes. Then to me, "Will you still be here in an hour, when the speeches are done?" "I'm not going anywhere," I said. I meant it more than I'd meant anything in years. Cordelia found me about 4 minutes after Nadia walked away. She was moving with that precise, controlled energy she gets when she is furious, but has decided to manage it until she can get somewhere private. She stopped in front of me, glanced once in Nadia's direction, then back at me. "What was that?" she said quietly. "She thought she recognized me," I said. "Recognized you." Cordelia's voice was flat. "Leland, that woman is our reason for being here tonight. Do you understand what you just did? She walked past me. She didn't even look at me. She walked past the executive director, past Council Member Patterson, past everyone, to come stand in front of you." "I know." "Why does Nadia Whitmore know who you are?" "She doesn't," I said. "That's what's strange. She thinks I look like someone." Cordelia stared at me for a moment. Then she picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray, took a composed sip and said, "Stay available, and for God's sake, Don't tell her anything about your nonprofit work until I've had a chance to introduce myself properly. She cannot find out we're connected before I've had a chance to establish context." Then she walked away to do damage control with the foundation director. I stood there and tried to remember how to breathe. The thing she didn't know. The thing I hadn't told her because there hadn't seemed to be a reason to tell her. And because it is the kind of information you learn to carry quietly after long enough, is that I was adopted. I was adopted as an infant by a couple in Lake Oswego, Oregon, named Howard and Patricia Ashworth. Howard was a civil engineer. Patricia taught 4th grade. They were kind, steady, capable people who loved me completely and never made me feel like I was missing anything. I never searched for my biological family. I told myself it was because I respected the life the Ashworths had built for me. But the truth, if I'm being honest, was that I was afraid of what I might find. When the speeches ended, Nadia Whitmore's aide appeared at my elbow. "Ms. Whitmore would like to speak with you privately. There's a side gallery that's been set aside." I followed him through a pair of glass doors, down a short hall past a collection of Pacific Northwest landscape photography, into a small gallery that had been temporarily cleared of its usual crowds. 2 chairs had been placed near the window. Nadia was already seated in one. She had a glass of water. No wine. She looked steadier now, more composed, though the composure had a careful quality to it, like something assembled recently. "Sit," she said. "Please." I sat. "I owe you an explanation," she began, "and possibly an apology for the scene." "There was no scene," I said. "You were very dignified." She almost smiled. My assistant would disagree. She set down her water glass and looked at me directly. "You know you're adopted." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "Do you know anything about your biological family?" "Nothing. The adoption was closed. I never tried to open it." She nodded slowly, like she'd expected that. "My father's name was Gabriel Reyes. He was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and came to Portland in 1958 when he was 19 years old. He worked construction most of his life. He was not a faithful man." She said that last part plainly, without apology. "He had 3 children with my mother, and we believed for most of our lives that those were all of his children. But when he died, that was 1994, we found letters, and documents, and a name." She reached into the small clutch bag she'd set on the windowsill and removed a photograph. She held it for a moment, then passed it to me. It was a black and white photograph, old, creased at one corner. A young man, maybe 23, standing on a street I recognized immediately. The St. John's Bridge in the background, Mount St. Helens visible on a clear day. He was laughing at something off camera. He was wearing a plaid shirt and work boots. He had my jaw. He had my eyes. He had the exact way I stand when I'm comfortable, weight slightly shifted to the left, hands loose at my sides. His name, Nadia told me, was Raymond Reyes. He was her half-brother, her father's son from a relationship that predated her parents' marriage. Raymond had been born in 1966 to a woman named Susan Callow, and Susan had given him up for adoption 2 months after his birth. Raymond had died in a car accident in 1989 at the age of 22. He had been married for 14 months before he died. His wife had been pregnant. The child had been born in the spring of 1990. The child's name, on a birth certificate that Nadia had spent years and a significant amount of money tracking through closed court records, was Leland. Raymond's wife remarried 2 years later, Nadia said. She moved. The records got complicated. And then Howard and Patricia Ashworth filed for formal adoption, and the trail went cold. She paused. I hired 3 different investigators over 28 years. The last one finally found the sealed record 6 months ago. It took until this month to confirm. The photograph was still in my hands. I couldn't look away from it. I have an uncle, I said finally. It was a strange thing to say out loud. It didn't feel real. I have cousins. 2 cousins, she said. My brother Elliot's children. They live in Bend. Elliot is 64. He cried when I told him we'd found you. She hesitated. I should tell you, we do not expect anything from you. This is not about the foundation or business or any of that. I want you to understand that clearly. I came to this event because it was already scheduled and I don't back out of commitments. Finding you was... It's something I've wanted for a very long time. But I am not here to complicate your life. I thought about Cordelia, in the other room, managing the narrative. I thought about my father, Howard Ashworth, who'd taught me to change a tire in the rain and never once made me feel like I was anything other than exactly where I was supposed to be. I thought about a young man named Raymond, standing on a bridge in St. John's with the mountain behind him, laughing at something I would never know. "You're not complicating my life," I said. "I was in that gallery for over an hour. I know this because when I finally walked back into the main room, the jazz quartet had been replaced by a string ensemble, and most of the appetizer stations had been cleared. Cordelia was standing near the bar with the foundation's board chair, and when she saw me walk in, she excused herself and crossed the room with the purposeful stride of someone who has been waiting a long time and is done waiting. "Where have you been?" she said. "Talking with Nadia Whitmore." Her expression shifted through several things in rapid succession. "For an hour?" "Yes." "Leland." She took a breath. "Do you have any idea how this looks? She left a room full of people, including people she's been introduced to go talk privately with my husband, with you. And you were in there for an hour. I don't know what you said to her, but I have been trying to manage the optics of this all evening, and I cannot do that if you're behind closed doors with—" "She's my aunt," I said. Cordelia stopped. "My father's name was Raymond Reyes," I said. "He died in 1989. He was Nadia Whitmore's half-brother. And I didn't know any of that until about 45 minutes ago." The bar noise continued around us. The string ensemble played something gentle. Cordelia looked at me with an expression I had not seen before, and I've known her face for 14 years. It was the expression of someone who has been operating on a set of assumptions and just discovered that the floor is different than she thought. "You're adopted," she said. "You knew that." "I knew that. I didn't know—" "Leland, she's one of the wealthiest private investors on the West Coast. Do you understand what you're saying? You're saying you're her—" "Family," I said. "I'm saying I'm her family." She stared at me. "This changes things," she said. It wasn't accusatory. It was almost wondering. She was recalculating. I could see it happening. "Yes," I said. "It does." I excused myself and went back to find Fletcher, who was still talking about the Deschutes River, and I stood with him and I listened this time, really listened, and I thought about what Nadia had said as we'd parted in the gallery. She'd shaken my hand, and then she'd done something unexpected. She'd held it for a moment in both of hers. The way Patricia Ashworth used to hold my face when I was sick as a boy, like something valuable. "Your father would have been proud," she'd said. "Everything I've learned about what you've done in your work, the years you spent overseas. He would have understood that. Raymond had that in him too, the need to be somewhere that mattered." I had not been able to say anything to that. I'd just nodded. But standing there listening to Fletcher describe the sound of the river in late September, I thought about it again, and something that had been tightly wound inside my chest for a very long time started, just slightly, to loosen. The weeks after the gala were among the strangest of my life. Nadia sent a formal letter through her attorney first. She was meticulous like that, wanted everything documented, wanted me to have time and information before I had to respond to anything. The letter outlined what she knew about Raymond, about his relationship with my mother Susan, about the family's search. It included copies of documents. It included a photograph of Raymond's grave in Multnomah Park Cemetery, which is 12 minutes from my house, a place I've driven past 100 times. I drove there the following Saturday morning. I stood in the rain. It was Portland. It was October. Of course it was raining. In front of a modest granite headstone that read, "Raymond Gabriel Reyes, 1966 to 1989, beloved son and husband." There were no flowers. There was no one else around. I stood there for a long time. I don't know what I expected to feel. Some kind of resolution, maybe. Some sense of connection. What I actually felt was simpler and stranger. I felt like I had finally confirmed something that I had always suspected but never been able to name. That there was a story I'd come from. That someone had existed who was part of why I existed. That I was not, as it sometimes felt in my low moments, something that had simply appeared from nowhere. I had a father. He'd been 23 years old and he'd died too young and he'd never known I was born. But he'd existed. He'd stood on the St. John's Bridge and laughed at something I would never know, and he'd passed something through the blood. Some restlessness, some need to be where things mattered, down to a son he never got to meet. It felt, standing in that rain, like being welcomed home by someone who'd been waiting a long time. I had coffee with Elliot Reyes 3 weeks later. He drove up from Bend and we met at a place on Burnside called Coava, which has 40-foot ceilings and the best single-origin Ethiopian I've ever had, and we sat there for 3 hours while Portland went about its business outside the windows. Elliot is a big man with gray at his temples and laugh lines so deep they're practically topographic. He looked at me from across the table for the first 5 minutes without saying anything, and then he said, "You've got his hands." Raymond's? Yeah, long fingers. He used to be terrible at construction work because he kept worrying about his hands. He laughed. It was a warm laugh, easy and uncomplicated. Drove our dad crazy. Raymond could have gone into it. The money was good, but he wasn't built for it. He wanted to teach, I think. High school history, something like that. He was always reading. We talked about Raymond. We talked about Nadia. Elliot described her with obvious admiration and a brother's tolerant exasperation, a combination I recognized as love. We talked about his kids, Petra and Cole, who were in their late 20s and apparently both heard about me and immediately demanded to know when they could come to Portland. And at some point, Elliot asked gently about my marriage. I didn't answer right away. "It's complicated," I said. He nodded like he understood that meant more than complicated. Cordelia and I had not been fighting, exactly. Fighting would have required a certain directness that we'd been avoiding. What we had been doing was something quieter and more damaging, circling each other carefully in our own house, speaking in complete sentences that communicated nothing, managing the surfaces of our life together while the thing underneath went unaddressed. The Gala had cracked something open. Not because of Nadia, not really. The Nadia thing was new information layered on top of an older problem. The crack had been there for a while, I just hadn't been willing to look directly at it. But after standing in the rain at Raymond's grave, after 3 hours with Elliot at Coava, after seeing my own hands described as something inherited, I found I was less willing to pretend. One evening in November, I made dinner. Nothing elaborate. Pasta, a salad, a bottle of Oregon Pinot that we'd been saving for a reason that never materialized. When Cordelia came in from work, I already had everything on the table, and I asked her to sit down. She looked at the dinner, then at me. She set down her bag. "What is this?" she asked. "Dinner," I said, "and a conversation I should have started a year ago." She sat. We ate for a few minutes in silence that was thoughtful rather than hostile, and then I talked. Not about Nadia, not about the Gala, about us, about the moment in the parking garage when she'd told me to stay in the back and not embarrass her, about the slow accumulation of smaller moments like it, about the fact that I had spent 3 years making myself smaller, and I wasn't sure anymore whether I'd done it to protect her or to avoid the discomfort of admitting that something was wrong. Cordelia is not a woman who cries easily. She sat across from me with her wine glass in her hand and she listened, really listened, without interrupting, and when I was done she was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know I was doing it," she said finally. "Or, I think I knew, and I told myself it was for your benefit, that you found those events uncomfortable, that you'd rather be at the edge of the room. But I think..." She stopped, restarted. "I think I wanted you manageable, and that's not a kind thing to want from a husband." "No," I agreed. "It's not." "I'm not going to pretend I wasn't also thinking about the business implications," she said, and I respected her for that. Cordelia is honest when she decides to be. But that's not all of it. I've been scared, Leland. You came back from all of those years overseas, and you know what you are? You're the most capable person I've ever been with. You've pulled people out of camps. You've negotiated in 3 languages with people who had guns. And then you came back here and you let me treat you like furniture. And I didn't understand why. It made me love you less, which I know is backwards. But it did. That one landed somewhere uncomfortable. "I was tired," I said. "I came home because I was tired and I wanted someone to manage me for a while. I think I handed you the reins and then resented you for taking them." "We're a mess," she said. "We're a mess," I agreed. She refilled both our wine glasses. "I'd like to meet Nadia," she said. "If that's appropriate. If she'd be willing." "She would," I said. "She's already asked about you." Cordelia looked at me for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were complicated," I said. "And that I was too." "I'm not going to tell you that everything resolved cleanly. Real things don't resolve cleanly. What I can tell you is this. Nadia Whitmore came to Portland again in December, this time without her aides, and the 3 of us had dinner at a restaurant called Ox on Northeast MLK, which does Argentine wood-fired cooking and keeps things warm and loud enough that a complicated evening feels manageable. Nadia and Cordelia were careful with each other at first, 2 very precise women taking the measure of a situation. But somewhere around the second glass of wine, Nadia told a story about Raymond that made me laugh so hard I nearly knocked over the breadbasket. And Cordelia's expression, watching me laugh like that, did something I'd been hoping to see again for a long time. It thawed. Petra and Cole drove up in January. We went to Powell's Books, because if you're family now and you live in Portland, you go to Powell's Books, that's just the requirement. And we spent 2 hours wandering separate floors and meeting at the coffee shop in the middle. Petra is getting her PhD in environmental science at University of Oregon. Cole runs a craft distillery in Bend and has opinions about local grain that make his father roll his eyes with the particular exhaustion of a man who has heard these opinions many times. They are both warm, smart, and occasionally argumentative in the way that people are when they've grown up in a family where that was allowed. They feel already like people I've known for longer than I have. Elliot and I have started a habit of calling on Sunday mornings. He's teaching me about fishing on the Deschutes. I'm trying to teach him anything at all about technology, which he describes as fighting a war with a hammer, and which I find very funny. Nadia and I email. She's not a phone person, but she's a thorough, thoughtful writer, and her emails are long and specific and sometimes include photographs. A few weeks ago, she sent me a picture of the plaid shirt from Raymond's photograph. She'd found it in a box of his things that she'd kept. She asked if I wanted it. I said yes. It arrived in a padded envelope folded carefully in tissue paper. It fits. Barely, because Raymond was a little leaner than I am, but it fits. I wore it to Kawava the next morning, sitting at the same table where I'd had coffee with Elliot, and I drank my Ethiopian single origin and watched Portland go about its business, and thought about the particular shape of what I'd been given. Not a resurrection, not a do-over. Raymond is not coming back. 28 years is still 28 years of not knowing. There's no undoing that. But there is this. A woman in a navy suit who walked across a room full of important people to stand in front of a man she didn't know, because she recognized in his face someone she'd been missing for most of her life. There's a photograph of a young man on a bridge, laughing. There's a plaid shirt that still smells faintly of cedar storage and old paper. There's a table at a restaurant in Northeast Portland where 3 people who had every reason to be awkward with each other found something to laugh about instead. And there's Cordelia, who is not fixed. We are not fixed. We are 2 people doing the slow, imperfect work of choosing each other on purpose, but who stopped last week in the middle of the kitchen and said, "I was wrong to say what I said in the parking garage. I've been wrong about a lot of things, and I'm going to try to be less wrong." It wasn't poetry, but it was real. And standing there in my own kitchen in Portland, Oregon, in the late afternoon light, I thought, this is what I came home for. Not the stillness, not the rest. This, the real things. The difficult, necessary, actual things. Sometimes you don't go looking for your story. Sometimes your story finds you in a museum, in the middle of a room full of people, wearing a borrowed tuxedo. Sometimes what saves you has been flowing somewhere in the world all along, in the blood of a half-brother who never knew you existed, in the decisions of a woman who never gave up looking, just waiting for the right, desperate, grace-filled evening to find you. My name is Leland Ashworth. I'm the son of Raymond Reyes, who existed and mattered and left something of himself behind, even though he didn't know it. I'm the nephew of Nadia Whitmore, who is exactly as formidable as you'd expect, and also, if you get her talking about her father, surprisingly tender. I'm the cousin of Petra and Cole, who are too smart for their own good, and I mean that as the highest compliment. And I am still the husband of Cordelia, complicated, precise, occasionally infuriating Cordelia, who is in the other room right now on the phone, laughing at something I can't hear. It's a good laugh, the real one. I don't hear it as much as I used to, and I'm working to change that. That's the story. That's all of it. You know what stays with me about this story? Leland spent years making himself smaller for someone who should have been making him feel 10 feet tall. And the moment he stopped, the moment he just stood there and let the truth find him, everything changed. Here's what I think. The people who are meant to find you will find you. But you have to stop hiding first. Stop apologizing for taking up space. Stop letting someone else decide where you stand in the room. Because somewhere out there might be someone who's been looking for exactly you for 28 years. And you don't want to be too far in the back for them to see your